Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bread of Life channel. I'm here with my friend Brian, and he's going to tell his story, his spiritual journey, and it's really an interesting one. And so I'm looking forward to hearing more in depth because I've heard a little bit of your story. But anyway, welcome, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Thanks so much for having me on. And I'm looking forward to kind of telling you more about my conversions, deconversions, whatever you want to call them. Um, so I can get started kind of from the top of when I first became a Christian and then go from there, or we can do it
Cool.
if you'd like.
Yeah. And
Okay.
I wanted to mention you have, and we'll mention this again at the end in more detail, but just wanted to let you guys know Brian has a blog, he has a YouTube channel, and the links to those are in the description. So maybe toward the end, you can describe more what that's all about. And so, yeah, go for it.
Sure. Thank you. So, I was kind of raised in, I guess, a nominally Christian home. Well, I say nominally Christian. Both my parents would call themselves Christian. I believe they are Christians, but we weren't a church going family, and religion was kind of limited to the occasional prayer before dinner. Every once in a while, we would throw on the televangelist on Sunday mornings. Um, so for me, I guess religion was more of a novelty growing up than it was for a lot of my friends that were regularly going to church. And I would always kind of cherish the opportunities I had to attend church with some of my close friends. And, but I wouldn't say like I was asking questions or skeptical in the beginning. And so when I was 10, I started doing, I always loved to draw. So I started doing art lessons with this woman who, in retrospect, may be a little fanatical in her views. But anyway, she started talking to me about Jesus. Her husband was a pastor. I started going to church with them, and I remember being saved, I guess, in one of her husband's services, and I told her husband, "Thank you for saving me." And he was like, "No, it wasn't me that did the saving." So I guess I didn't have a proper conception of what it really meant. And then with that same lady and her daughter, we went to like a mega church type service shortly thereafter, where they asked, like, "Hey, if you would like to give your life to Jesus, come on down." And even though I had already, I guess, been saved in her husband's service, I still raised my hand and went down, as though like the first time didn't take. Um, and I don't remember her ever asking, like, what's the deal with that? But anyway, so that, yeah, I think I was about 10 in both instances. And I felt, the goosebumps. I had a profound religious experience. I definitely felt like Jesus was um, a part of me, or, like I felt his presence. And um, it was enough to convince me that it was true. And, I as far as behavior changes after that, um, I think the religion influenced me to a degree, but I kind of remain the same person. Um, so, as it stands right now, I'm not sure if Christianity is true, but if I were to assume that it's true, I think looking back on that period, I'm not sure if you could call me a true Christian. Anyway, so yeah, I kind of remained in that state probably until I was 16 or so. Then I started asking a few questions, briefly became an agnostic, and then I kind of quickly jumped back on the Christian bandwagon. And I think it was mostly out of fear of hell. And I was kind of hedging my bets. It wasn't like an informed Pascal's wager type hedging of bets. It was more of just like oh, no, 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 I am a Christian kind of thing. So it was kind of a fear thing. Um, and so that was probably junior, senior year of high school. I guess I kept identifying as a Christian. And then in college, I had kind of mild existential crisis where I was like, I kept thinking that, even if I graduated, got the job I wanted, got married, had kids, had kind of the perfect life, I guess you would call it, from the American point of view. I kept thinking that that wouldn't be enough, and so I kind of started exploring religion a little more deeply. My fraternity had these Bible studies, and that was kind of where I started engaging with the Bible a little bit more. And I really became a big fan of William Lane Craig. I started watching a lot of his debate videos online, and that was kind of the first time I'd encountered a true Christian intellectual. Not that none existed before him, but that was kind of my first exposure to it. And I was really impressed with him. And, I'm still impressed with William Lane Craig a lot. I think he's a fantastic debater. And what I really loved was that he was fearless enough to put himself up against like really notable atheists. And, I watched the debate with Christopher Hitchens, and looking back, Christopher Hitchens, I don't think was like a great defender of atheism. But that was one debate where I was like, wow, the Christian just knocked it out of the park here. And so yeah, I was really impressed with William Lane Craig. Spent a lot of time only really looking at like the positive case for Christianity and not exploring the negation or the other side. And I kind of hinted at it, I guess, a little bit, like kind of began exposing myself to opposing voices after graduation. And one of those was like Sean Carroll, I remember. And yeah, I just began to ask, like, is this really true? And a lot of Christians that leave Christianity, I I get the impression that they want to make it seem like it was purely an intellectual thing. And for me, I think it was a combination. I think well, for me, it would feel dishonest to deny that emotions played any role. I dealt a lot with church hypocrisy. A lot of people that would have their hands up in worship were the same people that were kind of like gossiping and bad mouthing other people. And for me, it was just like, if there's a true desire for the Holy Spirit to come into their life and to change them, like what am I missing here, right? Like I get we still have free will, but I guess I was just expecting the Holy Spirit to have more of an impact, especially when the people seem willing to accept the moral change that can come from accepting the Holy Spirit. So that kind of opened me up, I guess, to the possibility that Christianity might not be true. And I get that that's not like a really logical argument or anything like that, but it did lend me, it did push me to start exploring the arguments from the other side. And as a result of that, I kind of went back into agnosticism. And yeah, I don't think I ever called myself an atheist. I mean, there were days where I felt like, it's almost certain that God doesn't exist, but like I'm still not confident enough to say anything beyond I don't know. And um, so I started the blog, I guess, in 2016, and at that stage I was still a Christian. And I wrote a blog on fine tuning, and then I wrote another one on why I didn't think the moral argument worked. And the moral argument I'm referring to is the one that William Lane Craig lays out, which is like, if God does not exist, objective moral facts and duties do not exist, but objective moral facts and duties do exist, therefore God exists. And yeah, I was just kind of laying out why I didn't find that very convincing. And there was a really long comment from this guy, Chris, who we eventually became Facebook friends. And through conversations with him, and we'll talk for hours on end sometimes, I went from agnostic to now I would call myself a theist. Or people have told me like I should be categorized as something other than a theist. Like a bare theist or a philosophical theist, but basically my position is that I think we have enough reasons to think there's a supernatural creator, and I find that compelling based on arguments like the contingency argument and the fine-tuning argument. But as far as whether or not God is kind of like the interventionist God described in many world religions, where he's actively answering prayers or performing miracles or providing divine revelation for holy texts and things like that, I'm still not sure of. So I guess you could say I'm a theist that like just um, doesn't label himself with any of the major world religions. And yeah, he and I have a lot more to discuss with regards to Jesus' resurrection. The talk I had earlier today was about the Apostle Paul and whether or not Paul was motivated primarily by money and kind of fundraising efforts, and so that was interesting. I hadn't heard that before, but that's kind of where I am now. And yeah, I just think I need to make more of an effort to critically examine not just Christianity, but the arguments for theism more broadly. And yeah, I love talking with people about it. So
Cool. Well, thank you for sharing. One thing as you were talking, you kind of talked about how you like eventually became agnostic, and a few times you became agnostic. But what was it like? What exactly from the arguments, or what was compelling for you that made you say, okay, this really does cause me to doubt the existence of God?
I think in high school it may have just been like an edgy skeptic type thing where I was like, well, I shouldn't downplay it that much, but it was far less informed than the later agnosticism. I think it was more of just like I don't really think there are any compelling reasons to believe this. Um, so until those are presented to me, I'm not sure. And I think that's a reasonable position. But yeah, when I kind of came back into Christianity early in college and then remained Christian through college and then went back to agnosticism, I think the second time I left was more informed, and that was kind of based on things like animal suffering, which I think is still a big problem for me. Um, Noticing parts of the Old Testament, and let me just say this: like none of my problems are very original, but yeah, noticing parts of the Old Testament that seemed greatly at odds with the character of Jesus that I had come to know, like God commanding the Israelites to slaughter the Canaanites, God sending a flood to kill everybody except for one family. These were and are troubling for me as someone who's, at least by my estimates, like open to Christianity. And yeah, those kind of things just didn't make sense. And so it wasn't like, oh, here's this alternative natural hypothesis to the resurrection that like I think accounts for all the data that much better, which would be great if I had, but it's just kind of those probably typical reasons that a lot of people begin to doubt Christianity. And yeah, I mean, at this point, I haven't, I don't think I've done the necessary homework to know whether or not those are knockdown arguments. Like, I know, I know people have written about the passages in the Old Testament, and they say, well, it's exaggerated language and it's hyperbolic, and it's akin to saying like this football team slaughtered the other team. But when it mentions specifically like women and children, leave alive nothing that breathes, for me that's kind of hard to wrap my head around. And if it is metaphorical, like what is the metaphor trying to convey? So that, like I mentioned, animal suffering, evolution. For me, evolution is hard to square because it's like God allowed for millions and millions of years of animal predation and suffering, but before mankind even arrived, and it's like, what purpose did that serve? So a lot of the typical arguments that people give to justify human suffering, like free will, as a result of your suffering, you kind of develop spiritually. I don't think really any of those work to account for animal suffering, because it's like animals aren't moral agents. They can't learn from prior mistakes, or I mean, they're not really eligible to sin. Obviously, Jesus didn't die for them or anything like that. So if some people say, well, they'll wind up in heaven, but I'm not quite sure that actually solves the problem, because then it's like the suffering still doesn't seem to have provided any good, either in the next life or in this life. Like, is it making them stronger? So yeah, those are just kind of a handful of problems. But yeah, that's kind of where I am now.
Okay. So if you had like well, right now you're at the point of theism. So is it kind of like how do you deal with the problem of animal suffering with theism? Like, how are you envisioning the possibilities for what God is like?
Yeah, so animal suffering definitely poses a problem for like traditional theism, or perfect being theism, where God is like the source of all morality. God is perfectly good. And it's arguments like the problem of animal suffering that lead me to think that kind of God maybe doesn't exist. But then there are other arguments like fine tuning and the contingency argument that make me think that at least like a supernatural creator exists. So I guess my sticking point is just on whether or not that being is good, or if he or she is good, then like what evidence is out there from the natural world that we can observe that would indicate that God is good? Some people point to things like love and beauty, and I think if you're able to do that, and I think that's that's a fair position to say, like, these things are relevant in determining whether or not the probability of God's existence is high or low. Then I would say, okay, well, then the flip side should also be true. Like, there are things that should plausibly count against God's existence too. Like when people say, um, God probably has good reasons for allowing these things, but we just don't know about them. Well, it's like, okay, if I think you could say that about anything, right? So it's kind of like uh, setting it up to where you know there's lots of examples that count in favor of theism, but anything that might count against God's existence, no, we just kind of discount that immediately, because, well, God might have a good reason, and he might, but um, again, I think you just kind of have to look at it probabilistically and say, what would I expect? And I think that's kind of what we all do, even if we don't recognize it.
So how long were you in this longest period of agnosticism?
Probably about like 2.5 years, I think. And yeah, I don't want to make it seem like I was doing a ton of deep diving and researching and soul searching during that period. I mean, it was kind of just like here are my reasons, and yeah, I have a lot more looking into this to do, kind of thing. And that's largely still the case. But yeah, it was kind of based on conversations with my friend where, you know, he would finish talking me through the argument and then be like, okay, so what is your probability now given this? Um, and I noticed myself gradually going upward, um, rightfully or wrongfully, but um, yeah, it was probably about 2.5 years, and I kind of I kind of wrote and explored some of the reasons a little bit, but um, Yeah, I think it was largely just kind of a slightly more informed version of the previous deconversion, but this time it was kind of like I had more ammunition, I guess, of reasons not to believe. So
And then what now makes you confident in theism, and how did you get there? Like, how did you go from being agnostic to, okay, now I'm like confident that there's a God, even if I don't know which God?
sure. So the two arguments I mentioned that I find uh, pretty compelling are
Hmm.
the contingency argument and the fine tuning argument. And so the contingency argument, as I'm sure a lot of your listeners know, is basically this idea that like um, things that exist only have two kinds of natures, right? They have contingent existence, which means they're dependent on something else. So, like a basketball, it doesn't have necessary existence, it requires humans to make basketballs, right? So, and people are contingent, right? Like we're contingent on our parents' existence, they're contingent on their parents' existence, so on and so forth. And so, uh, it's kind of a way to avoid an infinite chain of contingent things bringing about other contingent things. Um, the contingency argument contests that you eventually have to kind of arrive at this necessary starting point, which we would call God. And one of the reasons that I found quite convincing for why a necessary being accounts for a contingent universe or a contingent reality better than like a necessary natural phenomenon um, is what Blake Junta laid out in one of his presentations, which is it's called a selection mechanism, which basically just means like uh, hopefully this makes sense, but so whatever the first contingent thing is that came into existence, if it's contingent, then it could have been something else. And so in order to have an explanation for why it's that thing and not another thing, something had to choose that instead of potential alternatives. And really, the only way you get a selection mechanism is if there's a mind. Um, so for me, I find that pretty compelling, and I'm anxious to hear um, more objections to the contingency argument. But for me, like kind of what I've heard in response to this from the atheist side has been things like, well, there are brute there are brute facts, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with a brute fact, but a brute fact is basically just saying that whatever the thing in question is doesn't have an explanation for it.
Hmm.
So, um, if the moon were a brute fact and somebody asked me like, why does the moon exist? I would just say, well, it just does. And that would be my answer. And I don't find that satisfying. I don't find that very scientific. And, I'm sure atheists would say, I'm sure some atheists would say something like, well, you're just saying that God is a brute fact, right? God just exists. Um, but I actually think I take a bit of a different approach. Like, I don't think I arrive at the conclusion that God is a necessary being by definition, like in some kind of ontological argument sense, where, oh, by virtue of being like a maximally great being, God would have necessary existence. Those arguments are interesting and worth exploring, but that's not kind of the approach I take with the contingency argument. I kind of argue, for me, it's more kind of conditional. So it's like, given a contingent universe, given a contingent reality, I think that is best explained by a necessary being. So if a contingent reality exists, then that seems to me to make more sense if there is a necessary being. Hopefully that makes sense. Um, and then the fine tuning argument, which I know not a lot of atheists are fans of, but for me, it's quite compelling because of just the dramatic differences that the universe could have had, and it's not as though if we tweak some of the fundamental constants, um, at the inception of the universe that there would have been a different kind of life, like silicone-based life, or um, yeah, just a different kind of intelligent life. I mean, in nearly every other instance, it seems like making these very minor tweaks to the constants results in universes that are not just devoid of life, but of like planets, stars, chemistry, any kind of semblance of structure that we're familiar with in our universe pretty much gets thrown out the window. And so I have to ask, like, okay, we happen to be in the one universe where there is structure, there is intelligent life, and given the sheer improbability that that happened, I think William Lane Craig's approach of asking, like, is it due to necessity, chance, or design is reasonable. And I don't think there's good reasons to think it's due to necessity. For one, even if it were due to necessity, like based on some underlying physical law, then it would seem like that physical law would also need fine tuning, and it would be just as, if not more, coincidental um, if fine tuning were found to be necessary because of some underlying mechanism. If to say it's due to chance, like atheists will often say, improbable things happen all the time. Yes, they do, but like it's not just the mere improbability of it; it's the improbability and what results from it. So again, I only think it would be arbitrary for me to assign significance to our constants if other configurations of the constants would have produced like similar results. So, if changing the gravitational constant meant I wouldn't be Brian, but like um, there would still be intelligent life and planets and stars, then yeah, I think like it would be kind of arbitrary for me to be like, well, but like our specific universe is very, improbable. But to piggyback off what I was saying, like it's it's a combination of improbability and what results from it, and the fact that all these other configurations basically would have resulted in basically the same kind of universe, which contains effectively nothing. Or I think Luke Barnes said, like at most, a proton passes by another proton every trillion years. Um, to me, that seems that doesn't seem arbitrary for me to assign significance to this universe. And I think if it were as simple as just saying, "Oh, it's arbitrary," then I don't think physicists would be talking about fine tuning in the first place. Like, I think there's a reason why um, you have physicists like Sean Carroll and Victor Stenger um, talk about fine tuning and, okay, what are the explanations for this? How do we account for this? Is it a problem? I don't think there would be much discussion to be had if you could just say, well, like improbable things happen all the time. So those are kind of some of the reasons why I'm currently on the theist side.
Cool. Well, Lance, who's been on the channel a few times, has kind of uh, talked about the fine difficulty. Like for him, the fine tuning argument doesn't work because he says, well, that to me doesn't speak more about God's existence, because if God, if there is this powerful being out there, why would he need the fine tuning? So I could expect that, like, if I saw us alive and there weren't all these properties that were conducive to life, that would be a better, a better evidence for God's existence, for this intelligent existence.
Right.
So how would you respond to that?
Yeah. So I think when we were discussing that with Lance, I think I even conceded that um, it would be a greater miracle if we determined that like we're surrounded by poison and yet we find ourselves alive for 80 years. Um, that being said, just because I could grant that it would be a greater miracle if we found we couldn't exist, but we did, that doesn't somehow make necessity or chance better explanations of the fine-tuning phenomenon that we do have. And on a related note, atheists often say, like, if God is all powerful, he wouldn't need to fine-tune anything. I can agree with that, but at the same time, it's assuming that the only reason God could have for fine-tuning the universe is due to like a limitation. And I don't see any reason to think that assumption is warranted. I think all I need to do is present other possibilities for why God may have used fine-tuning. And then that argument kind of goes out the window. But I'm anxious to hear from your listeners if they agree. But yeah, some other possibilities I've considered is like maybe God used fine-tuning as a way of providing additional evidence he exists. We're talking about fine-tuning as a potential reason to think there's a God, so that's a possibility. Another possibility that I think is interesting is atheists often talk about God's wastefulness and God created this whole big universe just for us. I'll talk about that in a second too. And there's so much waste and there's so much empty space. But, I think it would be far more inefficient or wasteful of God if he made all of the constants conducive to a life-permitting universe, or take life off the table of a universe that can permit structure at all. Like, why would he make all of the constants, all of the potential values that the constants could have had, like if you imagine them as dials, why would he make them all conducive for a structure permitting universe when he's only going to use one set of constants, right? Like, that's why they're constants, because they remain the same. As far as I know, I think in our previous conversation, somebody mentioned the possibility that they change. So that's something I need to explore for sure. But I think if those possibilities are, if those options are even possible, then the atheist can't say like the only reason God could have had for fine-tuning the universe is because he's limited in power. But even if I granted that God fine-tuned the universe because he's limited in power, that would still mean theism were true. It would just mean God's not all powerful, but like there is still a semi-powerful creator, one powerful enough to create a universe, even if there were restraints involved. So I think even if I granted that, then we still have more to discuss, right? So that's kind of how I respond.
Well, Peter put this comment, and I want to hear what you have to say to this. It's interesting how the same argument seems so strong from some people's perspective and not so strong from other people's perspectives. So why do you think it is that for you, the fine-tuning argument is so persuasive? And then how do you feel about when you kind of like come again, like talk to people who don't find it persuasive at all?
Yeah, I mean, it just boils down to not everyone's as fortunate to be as brilliant as me. I'm just kidding. But yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Like, it's impossible to give an account for why every person would find an argument either convincing or not convincing. So all I can really do is explain why I find something convincing, and people can give their reasons why they don't find my arguments compelling. And I can weigh and consider what they say, and they can do the same with me. I think that's really the only route we can take. So I think the questioner is kind of getting at, like, it seems like there are people that have equal amounts of knowledge and yet don't reach the same conclusion. And I agree, that's kind of a stumbling block for me, like the problem of divine hiddenness, and why you have people like Cosmic Skeptic or Peter Millikan who devote their entire lives to studying the arguments for God and still find themselves not convinced. For me, that's kind of a problem. Like, I would hope God wouldn't punish them if Christianity or any of the world religions were true. for not believing, given that they've spent far more time investing uh, their brain power into these topics than, you could say for a lot of Christians. Um, so yeah, that's kind of all I have on that.
Yeah. Now, if you're in the chat and you have a question for Brian, I think now is probably a good time to put it in there. But Brian, I want to know, like, so right now you're theist. You have done like a lot of looking into Christianity, the resurrection, miracles, and that kind of thing. So, what do you think? Like, where do you think that's going? Like, have you found some things that are leading you back toward Christianity, or where are you at with that?
So I think as far as like where I am today and things that I think help make the case for Christianity stronger, I think modern day miracle claims, some of them at least, are fairly compelling. Like Craig Keener has written a lot about uh, some. There was a woman named Barbara Oakley Snyder, I think, and she I found this to be very compelling, just on the surface of it. And there's more to study on it, but basically, she had multiple sclerosis. She was bedridden for like over 10 years, I think, blind. Her arms were kind of curled up, so like the medical professionals helping her would have to like uncurl them and wash her. Um, and basically, the account, this was I think in the 80s. Yeah, the account goes that there were her Bible study came and visited with her, and then like they called a radio station asking for prayers for her, and um, I think shortly thereafter she heard a voice say like get up and walk, and um, I don't know if I mentioned that she was also blind, so she regained her sight, she regained her ability to stand up, she stood up, and even like the muscle atrophy from like not walking for so long had vanished, and she had calf muscles again. Um, and there were tons of witnesses to this. Like apparently she went out in the front yard and danced with her dad. And to me, that's just like I can't hear that kind of thing and dismiss that. And then I watched the documentary Sin Proof. I think Elijah Stevens is the filmmaker, and there were a lot of miracle claims in that movie that I thought were quite hard to dismiss. So yeah, it's those kind of things that for me make me think like, oh, Christianity, has a lot going for it. I can't easily say that miracles don't happen anymore, or God's not involved anymore. If he exists, he was only performing miracles in the Bible and things like that. I could be wrong, and all of these, extreme examples could be explained by something else. But I don't think you can just say, well, rare things happen all the time. So like every once in a while, something bizarre like that will happen. When it's in the context of like people just prayed, and I mean, you're losing the atrophy to your muscles, you're regaining your sight and your mobility all at once, and your ability to speak, like that for me is tough to dismiss. But I mean, there's obviously more for me to study on that, but that um as far as like what I think lends the most credibility to Christianity today, it's those kinds of arguments. And then I can touch on the resurrection if you want. But
Sure.
yeah, so I don't have a ton of background with studying like the arguments for the resurrection. I'm kind of familiar with the standard case, like the minimal facts approach, where historical scholars, regardless of whether or not they're Christians, Jews, atheists, agnostics, they all agree that Jesus died by crucifixion. Um, I want to say Gary Habermas says that 75% of scholars think that he was buried in a tomb. or no, excuse me, that 75% think the tomb was found empty. I can't recall. But the big one, obviously, is that like it's almost unanimous amongst scholars, regardless of what they believe, that Jesus was seen again after his death, and that could have been a hallucination. You know, it could have been. I think John Dominic Crossan calls himself a Christian, but he thinks the resurrection was spiritual. But yeah, it seems hard to deny that at least a few of the followers of Jesus saw something that convinced them that he had been raised from the dead. And just given the context of Second Temple Judaism and what they thought the Messiah was going to be like, and for Jesus to kind of defy those expectations like that, there's something there that's worth looking into. If I had to put a probability on how likely I think it is that Jesus was raised from the dead, I don't know. That'd be tough. Where I am now, and given the little amount of research I've done, I guess I would say like 15, 20%, which is probably quite high for a non-Christian. But yeah, I think there's something that needs explaining. Like even Jeff Lauder said, Jeff Lauder's an atheist, and he said, like, before I started investigating the resurrection, I thought it was easily as dismissible as like any other miracle claim. But I found out that I was like deeply wrong, or something like that. That's not a verbatim quote, but that was kind of the gist. So you have all these atheists that agree that, there's something going on. There was some kind of vision or hallucination or something. But yeah.
Here's a question from Lauren. What about the fine-tuning argument wasn't persuasive to you originally? What specifically made it convincing to you after your discussions with the friend you mentioned?
Great question. I think it was largely just like a place of, I'm not sure how much evidence we actually have that there is a fine-tuning problem, or, a lot of times atheists will say, and I think this is a fairly good argument, they'll say things like, every instance where we've thought in the past that there was a supernatural explanation for something, we turned out to be wrong. And so I was kind of thinking along those lines, like, it's probably going to be the same case with fine tuning. Like, it seems like there's a designer, but we'll probably figure out a natural explanation for that later on. And I guess what convinced me that it was strong was, like, again, going back to the necessity versus chance thing. I think even if it were due to necessity, that would still, I don't think that would really remove the fine tuning problem. Like, that would still be as coincidental, if not more. Chance doesn't seem to account for it, given that, like, basically every other configuration of the constants results in the same result, where there's just a dearth void of nothingness. And so I'm not worried that fine tuning is going to be wiped out by new scientific discovery, in the same way that I'm not worried that evolution is going to be wiped out, or our understanding of tectonic plates. Science is changing and it's evolving, but like, atheists, it seems like some of them want to have more of a greater skepticism that fine tuning will one day be eliminated from new scientific discovery. But I don't think they would say that about evolution, or at least find that likely, right? Like, they might say, if I were given evidence that evolution were false, I would change my beliefs. But I don't think they're seriously thinking that that's a high probability that one day that's actually going to happen. Like, there is enough evidence that leads people to think that evolution is the best explanation for the diversity of life. And similarly, I think there's enough evidence behind fine tuning to think that it's not just going to be wiped away with new scientific discovery. So hopefully that answers that question.
Cool. Peter says, how do you feel about the argument that transcendental laws of logic proves a creator mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't given that a lot of thought. I know there's arguments that like mathematics is a pointer towards God because it's so unexpectedly effective, and like that seems to make more sense if it originated from a mind kind of thing. That seems to be kind of what the questioner's hinting at. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't given that a ton of thought. Like if the laws of logic are these things that we discover, or if they're created and they're just useful tools. Um, so, yeah, I think there's probably good arguments out there based on those kinds of things. But yeah, I haven't done enough looking to know that for sure.
Jeff says, I flip between theist and agnostic on a regular basis, mostly agnostic. I'm still in the process of fine tuning my worldview.
Nice pun.
So, what would you say to Jeff? Do you feel like you're still flippable, Brian? Like, do you think you can flip back to agnostic, or are you like solidly theist? And then, like, what would you say to Jeff about his flipping?
Well, I would commend Jeff for his honesty, because I think a lot of people they want to feel confident in whatever camp they find themselves in, even if it is agnosticism. Because yeah, I feel like very few people are comfortable saying like, well, sometimes I think this is plausible, other times not so much. I would just encourage you to keep asking yourself why. Like, if if sometimes you think you're agnostic, just say, what is it about God's existence that I'm not finding plausible at the moment? Could I raise solid objections to these purported arguments or purported evidences for God? And do the same thing when you think you're leaning towards theism. If you're leaning towards theism, ask yourself, am I doing this for the right reasons because like I'm genuinely compelled based on the evidence, or is it a convenience thing? Like I know a lot of people are probably churchgoers, for instance, because their friends are, or they like the community aspect of it. So yeah, just keep being honest like you are now, and ask yourself why am I thinking this way, and try not to do so much introspection. I'm not saying you are, but I'm saying that was kind of one of my problems, was thinking that like a lot of answers were just kind of locked up inside my own head. There's a lot of smarter people that have thought about this a lot more than I have. So make sure you're reading, and don't just read and be done with it and then consume more videos. Definitely try and make it a point to have more of an output than an input. And what I mean by that is, if you're reading material about an argument, I think you should spend like twice as much time writing and reflecting on what you've been reading than intaking new material, because it's not going to stick if you're just constantly intaking new material. I mean, some stuff will stick, but that's where you really get like the deep knowledge, is when you pause and reflect and ask yourself, how does this relate to other things I know? And why do I find this compelling or not? So yeah, keep it up.
Well, I guess Lance heard me talk about his objection. He heard your response, and now he wants to respond with his objections. And let's see how you respond. He says, you don't seem to provide any positive argument for why God is a good explanation. God is allegedly better than chance or necessity, but it's trivially easy to say X is more likely than Y. It doesn't follow. Mm-hmm.
It doesn't follow that if X is greater than Y, therefore X.
Mm-hmm. And then he has a second objection. Do you want to answer the first one first, and then I'll put up
I
the
guess I'll give
second
them
one? Okay.
I guess I would say, like, if these really are the only three viable options, necessity, chance, or design, there could still be problems with the design hypothesis. but I've yet to see any that are like so insurmountable that they somehow make necessity or chance on equal footing. And um, I think that's all I have to do to prefer that option of design, is to think, even if I don't think design is very likely, if it's more likely, or if it doesn't have the same number of problems that necessity and chance seem to, um, that might not make it like this perfect option that you couldn't possibly object to. But to me, it still seems preferable. So I'm not sure if that's a great answer. He's probably not going to think it is, but he and I we can exchange beef on our Facebook Messenger. He can tell me where I'm wrong.
Okay. Now I'm sorry. Now here we go. Okay. Here's the other issue. You seem to concede that God didn't need to use fine tuning, yet you also think the best explanation for fine tuning is God. Yet you don't know why God would fine tune,
Mm-hmm.
despite not having any need to do so. This means that you're proposing God as an explanation for our observations, but you don't seem to have an explanation for why, just speculation.
Yeah, I think this kind of goes back to a point I've heard. I think it was William Lane Craig who I first heard raise this. Yeah, I'm not trying to rely too heavily on him, but his point about like you don't need an explanation of the explanation in order for it to be the best explanation, I think applies here, because it's like, sorry, can you read the first part of this second objection again?
Sure.
You
You seem to concede that God didn't need to use fine tuning, yet you also think the best explanation for fine tuning is God, yet you don't know why God would fine tune.
Right. So I guess I would just ask Lance, like, why do I need to have like perfect knowledge of God's intentions and his reasons for why he may or may not have used fine tuning in order to find the design hypothesis the best? Like, I might not know every reason a computer manufacturer has for building a computer, but I could still infer that, the computer had a designer. And that's probably not a perfect analogy, because um, computers are within the natural world and we're talking about the universe. But yeah, I guess I just don't see the need to have a full account for all of God's reasons for doing something in order to ever find an argument for theism plausible. Like, if I saw, to get into kind of like miracle explanations, let's use like a really hyperbolic example. If somebody were decapitated and people around this person prayed to Jesus for them to be healed, and their head reattached and they were healed, and then they lived a long and happy life, I wouldn't know all of God's reasons for having performed that miracle, and I don't think I would need to in order to determine that like theism is still, and Christian theism specifically, would be the best explanation for why that took place.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's kind of my response for now. Could be wrong.
Cool. I like that response. Iron Charioteer says, I subbed to your channel, Brian. Thank you so much, Iron Charioteer. And
Thank you.
and so this one next brings up, okay, Doubting Thomas says, where does God go for a tune-up? And that helps me ask, I wanted to ask you, what is your current conception of God? Like, are there properties that you think God has? Like, since you're a theist, like, what are the basic properties that you understand God to have?
That's a good question. So Rebecca, to answer your question first, I think God is an intelligent, I definitely think he's intelligent, has intentions, and is powerful enough at least to create the universe and create all kinds of things. The mechanism by which he does that, I'm not sure. And I'm not sure if I need to know in order to think God is the best explanation, to kind of touch on what I just mentioned in responding to Lance. So yeah, it's kind of bare bones, right? Like, I just think there's a supernatural creator that exists outside of the universe that is responsible for the existence of the universe, potentially answers prayers, maybe performs miracles. I'm not sure, but yeah, the properties. I mean, he has a mind and he's powerful enough to create. Where does God go for a tune-up? I don't know if this was like a joke or if...
I think it's kind of a joke, but
Okay.
to me, that it just brought up the question of, what do you think God is like? Would he be the type of being that would need adjustments?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I've kind of heard this phrased a different way, and Doubting Thomas can confirm whether or not this is what he's getting at, if he is. But I think Sean Carroll brought it up in... no, it wasn't Sean Carroll. I'm forgetting the physicist who brought it up, but they basically said, like, if God is the best explanation for fine-tuning, we have another problem, because that being would need even more fine-tuning than the universe he purportedly created. And to me, I don't even really understand what it means for a God to be fine-tuned. Like, does that mean God has like very particular attributes? Like, if he's not physical, like, does that mean he's got very specific intentions? Or so when you're talking about a being fine-tuned, I'm just not quite sure that's a coherent concept, which may or may not have been what Doubting Thomas was getting at.
So, Just Jeff says, I stopped going to church, but I know way more about the Bible now since I stopped. The church doesn't teach you everything. They purposely leave out things like the history of the First Crusade. Brian, do you feel like you were misled at church about what was in the Bible and what, like the history of Christianity and things like that?
Yeah, certainly to some degree. I think, for instance, the church oftentimes teaches that all 12 disciples were martyred for their faith. And I don't think there's enough evidence to substantiate that. Even Sean McDowell, he wrote a book called The Fate of the Apostles, and he's a Christian. And I want to say his conclusion is that we only have enough evidential substantiation to think that five of the original disciples were martyred for their faith. But it could be even fewer. And that doesn't mean there's no historical case for the resurrection at all, but that's an example where it was overstated. And similarly, like hearing things like, if you don't believe, it's just because you want to sin, or yeah, kind of acting like Christianity is the only game in town, and not exposing us to, like, hey, here's why some people are Muslims or Mormons or atheists. And I get, like, you're there to give a sermon, so you can't devote your entire time to like building an apologetics case every Sunday, but you can at least like do a little more to not overstate the case, and you can give people resources outside of the sermon to explore these kinds of things in more depth on their own. So I agree with Jeff that the church doesn't do a great job always of really informing the congregation of like the best arguments against Christianity. And I know people don't always have the leisure time to explore everything as much as they would like, but a little more effort, I think, would be awesome.
So Stephanie says, do any of y'all in chat believe in a divine creator that is not limited to any religion? Brian, what's your answer to that? Like, what do you think about like the state of religions? Can you imagine a creator that's not limited to one religion?
Yeah, I can certainly imagine one, and I guess technically I believe in one right now, but it's not because I've surveyed all the world religions as much as I would like and determined that like none of them are true, but like there's enough reasons to think that some God exists, so that's the God I believe in. Um, it's more of just like I have additional work to do to know whether or not the resurrection happened, or I'm kind of, and this is probably a big bias from growing up in America, but like I feel pretty confident like the God of Islam doesn't exist. Um, and I similarly I feel pretty confident that Mormonism is false. Um, but yeah, like I think it's perfectly plausible to think that there's a being that loves humanity maybe and prepares an afterlife for everyone. And it's not Jesus, it's not Allah, it's none of the gods of the major world religions. That'd be interesting, but um, yeah, there's more digging to do.
Cool. Iron Charioteer says, wants to know from you, Brian, do you believe in a soul?
That's a great question. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think I've given that enough study to know one way or the other. There are, for me, I think like some of the most compelling reasons to think there's a soul are things like near-death experiences where people are able to um, they provide things based on knowledge that they wouldn't have had access to had they just been stuck in their own body. Um, Now, assuming those accounts are true, right? But as far as like philosophical arguments that I've heard that I think make a soul more or less plausible, yeah, it gets a little fuzzy. I know there's arguments for consciousness being irreducible to the mind, and that's kind of an argument for the soul, or can lend itself in arguments for the soul. But yeah, I've got a lot more thinking about that to do. One thing that I think is underexplored in the Christian apologetics community is like evidence for the paranormal. Um, and I've always been like a big fan of spooky stuff and ghost hunting shows. And, you know, a lot of them are kind of cheesy and bogus, but um, so many people claim to have had encounters with the paranormal. And from my perspective, it seems like the paranormal maybe isn't impossible on naturalism or atheism. Well, definitely on naturalism, but on atheism. Um, but it seems far less likely and less expected that there would be things like immaterial spirits um, if theism weren't true. So I think that should be explored more by Christian apologists. Like, oh, here are all these people that have claimed to have seen this apparition or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, Lance has a lot more to say here. So, but I can't follow all this, Lance. I'll have to have you on a separate stream, and maybe Brian too, and we can really talk out these objections that you're raising. So, Brian, will you tell us a little bit about your website and your blog, and like why you started that and what it's about?
Sure. So, I mean, originally I started my blog because I was a Christian and wanted to defend Christianity. So my first post was like a pretty in-depth look at well, from my perspective, it was fairly in-depth, looking at the fine-tuning argument. I tried to address a lot of objections, like Sean Carroll's objections, and then I would talk about Jesus' resurrection and the contingency argument. And then eventually it became more of like a truth-seeking blog, and I guess that's how you would describe it today. It's kind of like me asking questions, like if Christianity is true, then how do you explain this kind of thing? And I don't always stay super locked in on the philosophy of religion. For instance, the last blog I wrote was about the law of attraction and whether or not there's reasons to think that simply thinking about something long enough means it's going to be manifested in your life. I don't think that's the case. But I talk about some potential positive psychological benefits that can result from regularly reflecting on what you want, why you want it, and your values. Yeah, I do want to explore kind of more broadly, like new age topics like that, spirituality a little bit more, the existence
And
of
it,
this.
you,
Yeah, go ahead.
sorry to interrupt you, but with regard to the law of attraction, what I remember from that blog post, you also talked about the negatives, about how like when you think that it's you're manifesting the things around you, then when bad things happen to you, you blame yourself, and that can be very negative.
Right, like it's totally a system that gears itself towards victim blaming because if you're abused, then you're at least partially responsible for manifesting that abuse into your life. If you're robbed, then that's partially your fault. You should have been thinking about not getting robbed, I guess. Uh, and it applies to everything, like terminal illnesses. If you get cancer, oh, well, you attracted that into your life. Now, and I say this in the blog too, there's some gray area where like you can contribute to something bad happening to you. Um, like, if you live a really unhealthy lifestyle, if you're constantly smoking and eating unhealthy and you get cancer, like to say that you attracted that into your life is a stretch, but like you also didn't do things that helped you not get cancer. Let's say you get lung cancer, where there's a direct correlation between smoking and lung cancer. I think another example I give is like if you wear a suit made out of $20 bills and you go into like a really rough part of town and you get robbed, you're still a victim, but like that wasn't a good thing. That wasn't a smart decision.
Mm-hmm.
You're increasing the odds that you were going to get robbed. Um, so yeah, there's definitely a downside to the law of attraction for people like me who are kind of overthinkers by nature and kind of second guess ourselves all the time. I just don't think that's a healthy psychological place to be in, where you think like every bad thing that happens to you, you're like crazy responsible for. Now you should
Yeah.
take more responsibility for sure when you can, but to think that even like natural disasters are partially your fault, yeah, I don't think that's a good way to live.
Yeah, people are asking if the link is in the description. Yes, the link to Brian's website, his blog, and his YouTube channel are there. Do you want to talk about what your YouTube channel is about?
Yeah, so the YouTube channel is just kind of largely an extension of the blog, and I haven't posted regularly on either, unfortunately, lately. But I did just put up a new one today where my friend Pete and I talk with our other friend Greg about the Apostle Paul and whether or not his motivations for his ministry were largely about fundraising and getting money, which was interesting. So I do plan on posting more regularly in the future, and um,
Cool.
certainly going to be exploring more of the philosophical arguments, probably with the help of Lance.
Now, James says Christianity is as debunked as anything can possibly be debunked. If Christianity can be true, then literally anything can be true. How do you feel about that statement, Brian? Like, how would you respond to that?
Um, well, I'm kind of curious what the two colons mean, but like Christianity is as debunked as anything can possibly be debunked. Anyway, yeah, I'm not a Christian, so I think there are good reasons for doubting Christianity is true. Um, if Christianity can be true, then literally anything can be true. I guess I would just, ask what's the evidence for that, right? Like, why think that you open yourself up to literally anything being true if Christianity is true? For instance, I can think of counterexamples to that. Like if Christianity was true, it seems to imply that Islam is false. So um, it seems like that would be an instance where Christianity being true would lead to us rejecting other claims, right? Because they're mutually exclusive. Jesus couldn't have both been crucified and only made to appear crucified, like Islam teaches. That's just kind of what I would say from the, yeah.
Got a question from Pine Creek. Brian, if you had to bet the life of a loved one on whether a deity exists or not, which way would you bet?
Ooh, good question. Yeah, it's tough. Like hypotheticals like this are tough because you're going to be in such an emotionally distraught place where I'm not going to be like objectively weighing all the evidence. Not saying I do that perfectly anyway, even when I'm like emotionally more stable. But I would probably think no, I wouldn't, just because I would be so distraught. And like if it came down to Brian, say God exists, or you lose your loved one, like would I have enough confidence? For one, the God I believe in, I'm not sure whether or not they are involved, right? So I think this question might be better for a Christian who thinks there is like an afterlife and things like that. But my conception of God, I'm not necessarily sure that's the case. So I'd probably say no. Like I'd probably be emotionally distraught and would care more about the immediate safety and health of the family member. Hopefully, I'm not misunderstanding the question, but yeah, probably saying no.
Yeah, it's kind of a vague question. I don't understand. Is the life of the loved one, you know, in jeopardy here? Like, are you betting that the deity exists and then your loved one will be saved, or what's happening? I don't
Well,
know.
so if he's not asking in the way I just kind of responded to, and he's asking more like, am I so confident that a God exists that like I would be willing to bet somebody else's life, to bet a loved one's life for it? No, I would say no. Like, I'm fairly confident. If you're wrong, your loved one dies. Okay. Yeah, I would say no, probably not. Like I'm probably not that confident to where I would bet on it. But maybe I should be, maybe I shouldn't be. So I don't know. It's kind of where I'm at
Yeah.
now, though.
Cool. Well, was there anything that I didn't touch on that you wanted to talk about?
No, I don't think so. I mean, yeah, I think I kind of gave as best I can, kind of my current reasons for thinking God likely exists. There's obviously a lot more for me to do, so hopefully we can talk again in the future about new things both of us are exploring. And yeah, thanks so much again for letting me have this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great having you on. And I just want to thank everybody who's been here for the conversation, asking great questions. It was a really fun discussion. So thank you very much, and hope you guys have a great weekend.
See you, everybody.